Thank you, Peter. We're a bit late. I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then there will be opportunities for questions and discussion and so on after that. But we'll still aim to break for lunch in good time. I'm going to talk about the possibilities of a new narrative for pastoral development and policy. It's purposefully got a question mark in there because we don't yet know what that might be. And one of our tasks in the summer school is to try and elaborate what this is. I'm going to suggest some hints at what elements of a new narrative might be, and we can pick up each of these elements as we go through the rest of the summer school. Because as various people said in the introductions this morning, the dominant narrative around pastoralism and pastoral areas is a negative one. And very often existing narratives that feed into policy can actually undermine pastoralism, their livelihoods and environments, rather than support them. So you're all doing research in different forms, and one of the things the research does is tell a story. And a narrative is just a story. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end. It tells you about what the problems are and what the potential solutions are. But very often there are competing narratives. And that's where power and politics come in. And our role as researchers, based on solid evidence and understanding of the settings we work in, is to come up with evidence-based support for narratives that are appropriate to the context we work in. And it's a big job, and that's why we're here together, because narratives are political, they have power. They're often associated with dominant actors, powerful positions that come from governments, from international NGOs, from a UN system. But they do need to be interrogated, challenged, and refashioned. And that's our job. That's our job as critical researchers. So it's just an absolute pleasure for me to be here, because I've struggled away at this for years and years and years, often slightly isolated, but it's just wonderful to have a committed group of people working on this theme, rooted in the places that you live in and come from. So, what are some of the dominant narratives that frame the way international debates think about livestock producers, pastoralism, and so on? Because livestock and livestock production often gets an incredibly bad press. As we heard from May this morning, pastoralists are deemed to be unviable livelihoods. They're destructive of the environment. They cause conflict. But we know that this is not true. And that's why the argument needs to be transformed. But too often there is this dominant view that what needs to happen is that needs to be alternative forms of livelihood, alternative ways of thinking about the drylands, which aren't based on mobile, flexible pastoral systems. Fixed in places, settled, intensive livestock systems, new breeds, stall feeding, feed imports, all the rest of the paraphernalia of the modernization of the livestock sector gets thrown at pastoral areas, often with negative results. And of course, as you all know, livestock are often cast as villains in the broader climate and environment debate. And questions about environment and health often come into a negative picture of livestock and development. Destroyers of the environment, destroyers of biodiversity, negative for conservation, contributors to global warming, causes of bad diets. So one of our jobs is to reflect from the context that we work in what pastoralism is really like, because it's none of those things. And that's why challenging narratives from a research base is so important. We see, and this is some work that we did as part of the Pastoralism project, which I'll talk about, now completed, where we worked in different countries around the world, looking at how particular policies were enacted in pastoral settings, but also looking at how pastoralists responded to those. And we see historically that there have been a set of policies that often undermine the capacities of pastoralists to respond to variability, to respond to uncertainty, those core features of pastoralist systems, through processes of control, simplification, management, and so on. A particular version of modernization that has colonial roots but has been carried through into the post-colonial era. So we have a whole variety of things that are seen to be part and parcel of pastoral development. Not all bad, by any means. Settlement schemes, early warning and risk management, insurance systems, investments in particular types of animal productivity, fixed markets, delimited, controlled grazing systems, and so on, and so on, and so on. And we can debate those. And some of you are researching these right now, exploring about how they work in particular settings. And as I said, not all these diagnoses and indeed these solutions are wrong, but they often carry a particular bias. It's a bias that I and others call a sedentist bias. That means a bias towards fixity, being in one place, not moving. And it's also a management and control bias. It's a bias towards top-down interventions, not thinking about bottom-up, flexible, adaptive alternatives. The narrative often goes, if pastoralists were more like us, in other words, people who live in towns, people who come from settled agrarian societies, things would be better. They have to be transformed. And much development, as we all know, is focused on this. And very often this development makes matters worse. And as I said, reduces the capacity of livestock keepers to manage and respond to and make use of variability, that resource in dryland systems that is so productive and is so central to creating resilience. And we'll come to that. But there is an alternative, a much more positive one that I want to encourage you to begin to think about and will be the centerpiece of the summer school throughout the rest of the week. And it's important. Pastoralists are not just in northern Kenya and southern Ethiopia and Somaliland and so on, the Horn of Africa, but pastoralists exist in different forms in different places in rangelands that cover over half the world's land surface. Millions and millions of people are pastoralists. And we often forget this. So many of our policies and development programs just blank half the world's land area. And these, of course, are some of the poorest and most marginalized people, and in some of the most marginalized and politically disenfranchised parts of the world. So I believe passionately that getting development and pastoral development right in pastoral areas really matters. But I have to say, to this point, the track record is pretty poor. Now, this narrative that I'm going to talk on builds on long-term work that's been going on forever, and I'm just going to put a few books up here, several of which I've been involved in. But it starts for me, and for my reading, in 1983 with Stephen Sanford's book on pastoral development. 1983, that's 40-something years ago. This is not a short-term process, and that's why the struggle to shift narratives is ongoing, and why I'm so excited that there are more people in this network and younger people who can carry that work on. So in addition to Gufu's books that he mentioned yesterday, these are some of the ones that I've been involved in. They're all, I think, open access now, and I can give you links to them. But let's move on to this question of what is pastoralism. It's kind of trite to explain this to an audience like this, but actually sometimes definitions help in focusing our attention on what really matters and how we think about development challenges. Because thinking about what pastoralism is suggests a very different way of thinking about development. So mobile, extensive livestock keeping involving a whole variety of different species. They could be cattle, camels, sheep, goats that we know from this part of the world, but also yaks, llamas and others from other parts of the world. They use these rangelands, these highly variable, often dry lands, sometimes montane rangeland that cover this huge surface of the world. Lands are, in the terms of the debate within rangeland ecology that Gufu mentioned, are non-equilibrium. They're not stable. They're highly variable due to the variability of climate change that exists. Many uncertainties around the knowledge about what happens in these systems. And in these systems, the most viable, the most sustainable livelihood system of all in these dryland and montane areas is pastoralism. It's been widely proved, it's been widely shown that the alternatives are often expensive, they fail, and aren't sustainable in the longer term. Yet we still see pastoralism, as I said before, cast as backward, as unproductive, as destructive. That these are places that are outside the state, they're the source of conflict. And often it is this framing by the central state, people in power, that says, we must civilize, we must control, we must manage these areas. This was an issue during the colonial period in Eastern Africa. It remains an issue now. And then there's been a long history of inappropriate development policies, with the end of pastoralism often proclaimed, as May said earlier on. But that's not to say everything is wonderful. We can't just go back to what existed before. My burning question for Gufu earlier was, great, let's learn from history, but there are some contemporary dynamics that we have to address now. And climate change that has existed for millennia exists in different forms now due to the effects of greenhouse emissions and global warming. It results most often in higher variability in rainfall. Now, the good thing is, as Gufu again said, pastoralists are best equipped to deal with high levels of variability. But often it remains a challenge as droughts come more frequently and the effects of drought become harsher, partly because the availability of land for flexible mobility is decreased through land and green grabbing of different sorts, for agriculture, for alternative energy, for mining, conservation, carbon, infrastructure, urbanization. This area here, if you drove from Nairobi, is a crucible of all of the above. And also what's happening in pastoral areas, it isn't a nice, equal, if it ever really was, arrangement where everyone is the same and that cooperation automatically happens. I mean, it's important, but there are processes of differentiation, social differentiation and elite capture that results in different forms of proletarianization, i.e. people becoming laborers rather than pastoralists, and pastoralism becoming a commercial operation for people who don't live here, an investment opportunity for people who are not necessarily from this region, or they may be from this region, but they're not from the place. The result of all of this is that pastoralism is changing. So I'm not an advocate of going back to the past, idealizing pastoralism, giving a sense of a sort of rosy picture. Let's be realistic about what pastoralism is today, 2025. Very different, actually, to the pastoralism that Stephen Sanford described in the early 1980s and late 1970s. It's more constrained, but there are also things that are happening that allow the core features of pastoralism, which is, as I said, making use of variability in a productive way through mobility in particular, such as the use of technologies, new forms of labor arrangements, and changing both age and gender relations that are reshaping what pastoralism looks like. So in our research, we've got to get to grips with that and think through what that means, both for pastoral societies, but also for thinking about policy. It's not the old pastoralism of the past. So what are the themes and challenges for the summer school? I'm going to highlight 7. I could have highlighted 20, and we'll probably delve into many more than this 7. But I'll use this as a way in to think about some of the key themes. And I'm going to run through this really quite quickly, because this is just to throw at you some ideas that we can pick up and discuss in much more depth, both this afternoon and through the rest of the summer school. So these are the 7. Got a nice picture, very contrasting to the previous picture of camels in somewhere near near Garbatula last year. This is the Tibetan highlands, but still pastoralism, still about mobility, still about flexibility, still about managing variability, but this time not necessarily drought, but snowfall. So there's a great commonality in different pastoral areas, and very often these coalesce around these 7 themes. And as I said, we're going to pick them up. And they link, and I've checked with some of the discussions we had earlier on, they link with some of your studies, and we can pursue them in more depth. And in each of these, I want to compare slightly stylistically the dominant narrative, the standard narrative that you're familiar with, that comes out of policy, that is probably what's often taught in universities still, sadly, with a new narrative which, as I've said before, emphasizing variability and conditions of uncertainty in knowledge. But I'm also going to emphasize, and that's what we'll be discussing when we come to that section that Peter mentioned before about policy and policy narratives, that things are difficult to shift. We found this over many years. I started my work in my PhD work in the mid-1980s, still at it. So we confront power relationships. We confront difficulties in getting evidence into policy. We confront embedded institutional frameworks and biases. We confront professional biases that exist in our institutions. We confront cultural biases that push back against an opening up and a deeper understanding. So our challenge is a big one, but if we don't do it, there is a huge amount of wasted resources that go into so-called pastoral development or drylands development that have been wasted over many, many, many decades. And as I said before, this at worst can undermine livelihoods and environments. So let's rush through these 7 very briefly. Let's start with mobility. You know the standard narrative. Mobility of both people and livestock is destructive, backward. I've said it before. Pastoralists should be settled. They should be modernized. They should adopt a civilized way of life. But as you all know, mobility is absolutely essential for you making use of the productive and variable resources over space and time, whether that's through the movement of animals or people migrating, or the movement of fodder to animals. There's always mobility going on in pastoral systems, and flexible mobility is essential. And if it's curtailed, it can be catastrophic. Now, this means not just more corridors and transport protocols, which are important, but it means a much more fundamental appreciation of what mobility implies and how they're constructed. So these mobilities are constructed around new infrastructure, with farmers, in relation to towns and growing urban areas, and so on. And how mobilities are constructed is essential, and I hope that will be a discussion that we'll run through. There's also an important discussion to have about how mobilities are sustained, despite everything. So we see new forms of scouting arrangements, the use of mobile phones, the use of scouts going out to look for grazing with motorbikes and so on and so forth. This wasn't available some years ago, but is central to managing and sustaining mobility these days. So mobility is essential, and I would say is the cornerstone, needs to be the cornerstone of pastoral policy, and it runs through all our discussions. That was the next one, yeah. So let's look at land and the environment. And I know many of you are working on land issues and environmental issues and so on. And again, you'll be very familiar with the degradation narrative that dominates our understanding of rangelands. And this is an old-fashioned narrative that comes out of an equilibrium view of rangelands, that too many animals causes overgrazing and the result is degradation or desertification. How many times have you heard that? But actually, when you're thinking of non-equilibrium systems, that form of degradation and the ideas of carrying capacity and so on and so forth don't necessarily apply. We often hear this term rangeland restoration. There are huge numbers of rangeland restoration policies. But the question we were discussing over dinner last night is restoration to what? From what? In highly variable settings, what are we restoring from to? And very often these restoration projects, and with them some of these nature-based solution projects that people have mentioned, have a vision of what is the ideal landscape, often a stable one, often one with trees, often one that is wild and is natural, but it's a constructed one. If you came to Camp Simpiri in the middle of the rainy season, it would look totally different. A moment and think, oh, this place is degraded. Oh dear, we have to have a nature-based solution project here. Wait for the rains, it's going to change. So fixed land management and with that tenure regimes that have been applied to rangelands often don't work because we have this variability and because fixed tenure regimes with fences and controls of movement undermine the core feature that I've just talked about before. So we have to realize that rangelands are non-equilibrial in drylands, that they're open ecosystems with a mix of trees and grass that fluctuate dramatically and are sustained, yes, sustained by grazing and fire. Grazing and fire are not necessarily damaging things. In fact, that grazing and fire in these systems create the biodiversity, create the conservation value, create the ecosystem value of these settings. So the new rangeland ecology that I've been involved in for some years, as Gufu mentioned, is all about thinking about variability, thinking about ecosystems in different ways. And it recasts the way we think about land and environment dramatically. We also have to think about the spatial heterogeneity of land and landscapes in rangelands. Because within these dry land landscapes, there are what we would call key resources. So that we are sitting by a key resource here, the river. Why is that a key resource? Because at the end of the dry season, like now, these are vital places for livestock to go to sustain themselves through to the next season. Wetlands, riverine areas, different places that provide these vital resources within an otherwise relatively barren landscape at particular times of year. The problem is that these key resources are also key for others. These are the places that get grabbed by external investors. Those of you from Ethiopia will know the Awash Valley, the expansion of the sugar plantations there, and the removal of key grazing land for livestock producers in that part of the country. You remove just a few hectares of key resource, you destroy the ability to make use of hundreds of hectares of drylands. That's the way that the heterogeneity of drylands works. So we need to argue for a much better and more complex understanding of rangeland ecologies. Too much rangeland ecology is taught from the Midwest of the United States, which is relatively temperate, where you are managing land in a very ordered fashion with grazing systems in particular ways. The Australians are slightly better, but not completely. So we need to teach both the Americans and the Australians how real rangelands are managed in flexible and open ways. And it's interesting literature, both from Australia and the US, which is beginning to appreciate that. Flexible, open, hybrid tenure arrangements that are responsive to variability and allow movement and negotiated access between resources across a landscape mosaic. That's the crucial feature of a new narrative about land and environment. In respect of climate, I mentioned this right at the beginning, it's a cornerstone of international policy debate at the moment. Climate is on everyone's tongues. COP30 is coming up at the end of this year in Brazil. Many people are thinking about how to address climate change, which is an important issue. But too often, these efforts focused on climate change, which is an important issue, I said it just before, I just repeated it, are misguided because they take climate away from the context within which climate change evolves. Gufu's lecture yesterday was a nice illustration over a long sweep of history, but it's important now as variabilities increase and so on. But the simplistic narratives about climate and livestock have taken hold, and they've taken hold particularly in the West, and particularly in international organizations and parts of the international climate IPCC. Somebody's going to join the IPCC. I can't remember who it was. You were standing over there. Go for it. It's important because we need new thinking in the IPCC, in the UNFCCC, in these international systems that are thinking about this most important question, because otherwise we get these standard, technical fix, globalized solutions imposed in the name of climate change response in places like this. The same applies with this whole debate about animal-sourced foods. Meat and milk are seen as bad things, and they are if you eat too much of them, as people in Argentina and the United States and parts of Europe do. But in many parts of the world, including this part of the world, animal-sourced foods are absolutely essential for good health. Not only available protein through meat and milk, but micronutrients, folates, vitamins, and so on. And this is well proven. And the advocacy around livestock and health and climate needs to shift. Of course, livestock emit methane, that is a fact. And methane causes global heating, that is a fact. But different livestock in different places emit methane in different ways. And we need to start doing some proper research on this, because the availability of data largely comes from large, big bred animals in Europe and North America who come from industrial contained systems which produce a huge amounts of methane per animal. The average animal out there in the rangelands here does not. And particularly when they move and when carbon gets sequestered in different ways through manure and urine and so on, the implications for climate change are radically different to what is assumed in the standard narratives about climate. So it's the old argument. It's not the product, meat or milk, but the process by which products are produced. Industrial systems versus mobile extensive systems. It is radically different. And we need to get this argument into this debate. Otherwise, injustices are caused towards pastoralists as livestock in general are blamed by well-meaning people very often, are blamed for the climate catastrophe. So this doesn't mean that climate change is not happening. I've said this many times. The causes are clear, but the causes are clear because of a particular industrial system, an unequaled industrial system of livestock production, of which pastoralists are not part. So we have to draw on the long histories of climate adaptation, again that Gufu talked about last night, to think about how livestock and livestock systems can respond. Because climate change is with us, it's going to continue, variability is going to continue to increase. Pastoralists are incredibly good at managing variability, but not always successfully, and probably will need some help. So we need to not replace livestock pastoral systems, but support pastoral systems to deal with the new patterns of variability and new forms of adaptation that emerge. Markets. We've talked about markets a bit already, and there's a huge amount of interest and investment in market development around livestock production. The idea being, obviously, that by capitalizing on the value of livestock products, livelihoods can be improved through new incomes and trade. But again, the standard narrative about livestock and markets is always negative. Oh, these people don't sell their animals at the right time. Oh, these people are only interested in culture. Oh, they love their animals too much to sell them. Gufu showed that one of the earliest systems of international trade was livestock trade, dating back to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago, across the Sahara, across the Arabian Straits, driven by pastoralists and pastoralists as brokers in market systems. So, of course, pastoralists respond to markets, but of course, pastoralists are engaged in markets. But which markets and how? That's the question. Very often, the total market value, oh, thank you, I was just about to go and rush for that. The total market value of pastoral outputs is massive. People have done these calculations, thank you, Peter. People have done these calculations of the amount of export from the Horn of Africa to different parts of the Middle East, and the value in GDP terms, if it was actually counted, is huge. So pastoralist productivity in market terms, it often goes completely uncounted. But they are generating and have always done very, very large revenues through complex trading and market systems. Yet the standard, dare I say it, US aid system for imposing market development in this part of the world is a fixed, big market with a set of assumed regulatory systems with it, with weighbridges and all the rest of it. Those big markets often get left behind. I was once in a car journey with the great late Stephen Sanford through Ethiopia from Addis Ababa to Yabelo, and he pointed out, because he'd been working so long in this region, oh, that was the USAID market project then, that in the 70s, that was the one in the 80s, that was one in the 90s, all archaeological sites with no activity whatsoever. Where did the market talk to Guyo later? In these distributed informal markets that are related to networks that are much more diverse, nested arrangements for markets. Let's understand how real markets work, not impose a vision of markets from on high. So many of those markets, those old fancy markets, exist as relics, testaments, I think, to the failure of a standard narrative. Conflict is another theme, and we should discuss this, although it may not be one of the themes to discuss this afternoon, but we should come back to it. One of the themes that comes up again and again, and conflict is a real feature of the constrained environments within which pastoralists now live. The land and green grabs constrain the ability of people to move, the flexibility that allowed overlaps and fuzzy boundaries, increasingly forms of registration, forms of conservancies and the rest of it, create boundaries where they didn't exist before. There are processes of militarization, securitization that exist in these spaces that prevent mobility, increase conflict. We see this in different parts of the world, including across the Horn, but in the Sahel it's become increasingly challenging because pastoralists have got involved in wider conflicts around access to land and resources. So pastoralists then are blamed. Pastoralists cause conflict. We must settle them. is the sort of standard version of this narrative, but we need to recast that narrative, rethink that narrative, to look at the underlying causes of conflict. Conflicts often emerge not because pastoralists have some kind of inbuilt proclivity to fight each other. Conflicts emerge often because of long-term neglect of pastoral areas by the state, the fragmentations of local authority, the inability of local governance systems to manage conflict, and the increasing stratification, particularly through the growth of absentee herders, of areas that don't allow people to negotiate conflict in the ways they once did, and the resource grabbing through agriculture and energy investments and carbon and all the rest of it that make these areas more and more constrained. So let's not pretend that conflict doesn't exist, but let's think about why conflict does exist and what alternatives might emerge from conflict negotiation and conflict peace and peace-building processes that exist in settings like this. Building trust, negotiating alternatives, sharing resources, and how can that be supported by the state and by others? Let's go to the thorny question of humanitarian aid. Pastoral areas, particularly in Africa, have huge amounts of humanitarian aid that flow into these areas every year. Not necessarily always associated with a drought or a disaster, but often humanitarian aid comes late, and it just is part and parcel of processes that are notionally benevolent responses to the challenges of pastoralism. But these are built, and the justifications for so much humanitarian aid are built on these old narratives that pastoralism is finished, they have to be reliant on food aid, they need to be transformed, let's use this aid to transform them out of pastoralism into irrigated agriculture, move them to towns, etc., etc. And we all know, and many of you are involved in these projects, the type of investments on early warning, on anticipatory action, on relief, food relief and cash transfers and the rest. And again, I'm not saying all of these are bad, but I think sometimes the logic on which they're premised is sometimes flawed, because the result is top-down emergency responses targeting so-called vulnerable individuals and households through time-limited, event-driven, often late deliveries of humanitarian support. We could all come up with examples of this, of which there are many. But in this top-down approach to humanitarian aid, there's much less attention to what we will be discussing a lot of during this summer school, local forms of assistance and support, forms of sharing, what some would call the moral economy, the ability through which people may be making use of external inputs, but on their own terms, and continuously, not as part of an emergency response where aid gets dumped and doesn't necessarily result in the sort of livelihood change. So I think over time there have been some shifts. I mean, there's a wide critique of the top-down classic humanitarianism that I've just described, the crisis-led emergency-led humanitarianism. We know it doesn't work. And there's been a shift to what some have called in the literature resilience humanitarianism. The sheep knows we're in support. Yeah, solidarity. Yeah. There's a shift from the top-down humanitarianism to the resilience humanitarianism. But this often just results in more and different top-down projects. How many climate-smart projects have you come across? How many resilience projects have you come across? How many climate adaptation projects have you come across? Not all bad by any means, but often premised on intervening to change and transform pastoral systems, rather than building on local, vernacular forms of response that we call in the CRDD project, building resilience from below. So I think this means some big changes if we adopt this narrative, and we can debate it. It means moving early warning systems from just technology-led prediction, information dissemination, last mile gap filling, etc., to much more thinking about deliberation around uncertainties derived from multiple forms of knowledge. It means shifting emergency response and relief from this event-focused, single, disaster emergency and targeted to vulnerable individuals and households approach to one that's much more about long-term support, much more about linking to local forms of sharing and redistribution and forms of moral economy. It's a big challenge. The humanitarian system and the agencies involved, from government through the international NGOs and local NGOs through to the UN system, are embedded and stuck in particular ways of doing things, and there's a big politics around that. Shifting that is a challenge, but one that I think is important for pastoral areas. This is my last of the 7 themes, and I'll conclude after this, which focuses on resilience. So this is a buzzword we all talk about. Even our project is called Building Resilience from Below. Resilience was in the supposed title of this talk, which I'd forgotten about. But there are many implications for thinking through what do we mean by resilience. And there's a working group, I think, a bit later to help us begin to do that. So the standard way of thinking about resilience, which is effectively how a lot of resilience projects think, is essentially a technical engineering approach. You have a shock, you go down, and then an intervention comes in, and you bounce back. That's the sort of engineering version of resilience. But actually resilience should, I think, be thought about much more as a process. It involves change and transformation. So you may have a shock, but things change through that. These droughts that have happened in this part of the world have changed how pastoral systems work. So change and transformation is part of that, and then you may end up, after a shock or a stress, in a different place. And how you do that is not necessarily through just an external intervention, as you would do in building a bridge to be resilient. It's about relational, it's about networked, it's arrangements, it's about social phenomena. And that's what we think is about what we mean by resilience from below. It must be relational, it must be networked, it must be social. And we come to that conclusion because pastoralists' own responses are exactly that. They're based on social networks, they're based on caring and moral economy, they're based on responding to unfolding uncertainties, not singular shocks and events, but things that change. If you talk to pastoralists, they say, well, drought is normal, that's what we do, but we're responding continuously to that. It is crucial. Rahma and Washira tomorrow will talk about a particular way of thinking about that, that we've borrowed from people who talk about high reliability in infrastructures. I won't go into it because they will talk about it. But the talk of high reliability professionals and high reliability professional networks is centrally about building relational resilience in places where repeated shocks and disasters potentially happen, and these networks and professionals can offset them. Because we can think about pastoral systems as critical infrastructures, as network systems that can respond and transform high variability to relative stability that allows people to function. That's the challenge. And there are particular skills and capacities of people in these systems that build resilience from below that allow this to happen. They can scan the horizon, they can respond to local settings, they can network and create relationships that allow change to happen. And there are many, 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 many examples of that, which we'll be discussing tomorrow. External interventions then on resilience don't need to replace this by a climate smart project or a chicken project or a horticulture project or whatever project you can think of. They need to build and work with such systems. And that's the arguments that we're working with MIDP and others in the region to think through what that might mean. That's a summary of where we've got to so far. I'm going to conclude more or less now. I'm not going to go into this table, but you can see that the shift from the existing narrative to a new narrative is quite dramatic across all of these themes. But there is a central argument here, and the central argument is that thinking about variability and with that uncertainty suggests very different ways of doing things. And if we can get that into our heads as researchers, and we can articulate that through our arguments about policy and practice, we may be getting somewhere. So our job is to help generate this new narrative. I haven't fleshed out the details of this, but I think together, in alliance with others, that's our collective mission and what I hope the summer school can contribute to. And this new narrative is, as I've said before, and just to re-emphasize, is productive, is modern, but in a different way of thinking about modern, because it's based on mobility, it's based on technology, it's based on flexibility and adaptability, and it's based on embedded social relations and networks that shift the debate across all those 7 themes. And this is what we'll be fleshing out in the discussions later on. And it's important. Our job, our collective job, and your job as researchers is important. Pastoralism is a vital livelihood system the world over, and particularly in this part of the world. And the consequences of failing to shift this narrative are significant. Wasted resources, inappropriate resources, failed livelihoods. So that's why this summer school, I think, is so important. To develop this thinking, to develop this discussion, to develop the network around which this discussion can happen after this week together. And all credit to CRDD and the organisers and ACIR for supporting it, because and JO and Tufts for supporting it, because it is so important. And you have been selected from hundreds of applicants to this summer school. So you're a very important bunch of people. So give yourself a round of applause. I'm going to conclude now. There's lots of resources to draw upon. I can share some of these through the WhatsApp and email things. I think some of them have been shared with you before. If you want to follow up on some of these themes after the summer school, there are several online courses that you can follow, and I very much look forward to the conversation over the coming days. And I think there's the Pastor's website, where a lot of this material you can find more detail of. Sorry, I went over,
No problem.
but there we are.
Thank you, Ian. Very good.
Resilience. How do you measure resilience?
Measurement.
Measurement, okay.
The measurement of resilience. Measurement obviously follows from the definition. So if you define resilience simply as the ability to bounce back from a particular setting, then you can have all sorts of quantitative measures that allow you to measure the response to a particular shock. And that's often the conventional way that resilience measurement goes about it. But it assumes that engineering form of resilience. It assumes bouncing back to the same place, and it assumes that happens just simply because there's an intervention, and that happens through that sort of classic ball and cup model that you see in the resilience literature. I think that's the wrong way to think about resilience, particularly in drylands and particularly in pastoral systems. This makes it actually more difficult to think about measurement of resilience. But if we understand resilience as process, as forms of transformation, as connected to relationships, and rooted in networks, then if you really want to measure it, and these may be qualitative measures, and almost certainly will be qualitative measures, you're going to have to think about how you understand transformation, how you understand relationships, how you understand networks. And all of those are feasible to look at, but it derives from a very different framing and definition of resilience. And the big problem is with the drive to measure, the drive to assess, the drive to quantify everything, which comes from the audit culture of donors and so on and so forth, is you end up by default with the first definition and those sets of measurements. I don't think those sets of measurements help us understand resilience.
Okay.
Something that I haven't dealt with in great detail, but after the last drought and when I was with the Rendile community, what came out very clearly was the mental health issue that comes from constant variability and intense variability, and yet we have very little research. I was looking on mental health following this adverse effect. So on one hand, I'm just a little conflicted. On one hand, we are saying we need to work with variability, but on the other hand, increasingly intense and frequent variability is a source of great mental health issue for the pastoral communities. So what really needs to happen at the peak point of these climate anomalies?
Okay, that's the
Very
question,
good
right?
question.
Okay.
The mental health issue, I think, is really important, actually, because uncertainty, variability causes anxiety, causes stress, causes forms of mental health challenge. And I think these droughts, recent droughts, are significant in that. One of our CIDD colleagues, sponsored through the ACIR from Australia, did some interesting work looking at the gender differences in mental health impacts of droughts. And interestingly, she found that it was men more than women who suffered more mental health stress as a result of this period. Why? Because women had found new forms of reliability through trading, through other activities associated with pastoralism that allowed them to ride through the drought, whereas men who were reliant on traditional pastoralism had lost a lot of animals, which was associated with their identity and sense of manliness, to put it like that. And they felt helpless because they weren't able to implement some of the things that were necessary for their... Is that a reasonable summary of Beck et al.'s paper? And I thought that was really interesting because the gender dimensions of mental health, and mental health is not very often discussed, and the gender dimensions discussed even less. And this was a surprising finding to me, because one often assumes that it was women who would suffer more and blah, 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 blah. But we have to then think, well, how, in intervening in these drought settings, can you develop forms of reliability that are gendered, that do work for both men and women, that provide the space and opportunity for people not to feel that everything is lost? And I think that's a real big challenge. And one of the things that what we will talk about tomorrow, what high reliability professionals and their networks do. We are thinking about synergies between climate adaptation, ecosystem conservation, and well-being. We've got to start with that understanding. What we can't do is have climate change adaptation interventions or ecosystem restoration interventions that undermine the capacity of people to generate well-being through managing variability. And to my mind, that means rethinking quite fundamentally the way we think about most climate adaptation interventions and most ecosystem restoration interventions. And it means thinking about rangelands as variable, open ecosystems that are non-equilibrial. And I think that has a whole series of implications, which we can discuss more. The others...
So are you saying that well-being should be driving all of these?
Well, you'd have to start with the question about how does well-being get generated?
Okay.
Through what ecosystem processes? So, the other three, I think, overlap, and I'll take them together in a way. I mean, your argument is there's an absence of policies. There's actually quite a lot of policies, but they're not the right ones. So, I mean, that's part of the problem. And the type of policy framing that exists in many countries, and you can choose any country and it will be more or less the same, does affect negatively how pastoralists respond. So, in a sense, the answer is yes. But then we have to ask, well, what policies and how does this type of thinking get integrated into policy? That's the challenge I was talking about, because I mentioned, the work of Stephen Sandford 42 years ago. That book was published, said many of the same things that I just said, not all of them, but many of them, and still, generations on, it still hasn't found its way into policy. And that's part of the problem, is that the linkage between research and policy isn't that effective. There's a real challenge in getting new forms of research evidence around non-equilibrium systems, around flexible pastoralism, around mobility, and around all of these things that we've been talking about into policy thinking. Why is this? It's not because people are stupid. It's not because people don't even listen. It's not because there aren't hundreds of workshops that say exactly the same thing. It's because of power and politics and control. There are certain people in the policy system in most countries who have vested interest against thinking about these things in this way. And that means there's a real political challenge in shifting the narrative.
Okay, yeah, we agreed with everything that you presented, but then we asked ourselves, where is the home of the new narrative? Is it in academia? Is it in practice? Is it elsewhere? Or in between the two? Thank you.
So shifting narrative isn't just about new forms of evidence, it's about shifting the political process around which narratives get into policy, which is why Guyo's question about where should the home of this alternative thinking be? It shouldn't be just amongst researchers, 100%. Researchers should be part of it, but I think by and large, and it's not exclusively this case, but by and large, people engage in pastoralism, and we saw it in your Rivers of Life, feel passionately about this issue. It's from where people come. It's what people do. It's people's lives and lived experiences. That's why it's important that most people in pastoralism research are also activists, and they're also engaged in processes of change. And that's why the home of this debate must cut across research, policy, activism, and so on. And we have to think creatively how to create those spaces that allow this to happen. Because if there was an institute for the alternative narrative of pastoralism, forget it, it would finish. So it has to be an active process, and that's why I think the network summer school process that this event hopefully will generate is the home. It's flexible, it's ongoing, it's part of a passionate response